It began not with an explosion, but with silence, the quiet hum of a laboratory in Berlin, late December 1938. The world outside was sinking into chaos. Hitler's Germany had already consumed Austria, and the shadow of war stretched across Europe. Yet inside the modest basement of the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute for Chemistry, two scientists were staring at the impossible. Dr. Otto Hahn and Fritz Strassmann, both chemists, were bombarding uranium atoms with neutrons, expecting to create heavier elements, something at the edge of the periodic table, maybe element 93 or 94. Instead, when they analyzed the residue of their experiment, they found barium, an element roughly half the weight of uranium. It made no sense. Nothing in classical physics allowed such a result. An atom, the indivisible heart of matter, wasn't supposed to break apart. For days they rechecked their instruments, recalibrated their counters, repeated the experiments. The result was the same. Uranium, the heaviest natural element on Earth, had somehow split. They didn't understand it yet, but the most fundamental law of the universe had just been rewritten, and the modern world was about to be born. Far from Berlin, in the snowy exile of Sweden, Lise Meitner, Hahn's longtime collaborator and a Jewish physicist, forced to flee the Nazis months earlier, received his letter describing the results. Sitting in a forest with her nephew, the young physicist Otto Frisch, she began scribbling equations in the margins of a newspaper. The answer, when it came, was breathtaking. Uranium wasn't merely reacting, it was dividing, splitting its nucleus into two smaller atoms, and when that division happened, a tiny fraction of its mass vanished, converted directly into energy. Meitner and Frisch did the math using Einstein's famous equation E equals mc squared. The numbers were staggering. If even 1 gram of matter were converted into energy, it would release as much power as 20,000 tons of TNT. They looked at each other, stunned. "We have found a way," Meitner whispered, "to tap the energy of the stars." Word spread quickly through the small, interconnected world of physics. Letters crossed borders, phone calls whispered across universities. In Paris, London, and New York, physicists read Hahn's report and felt their blood run cold. If this discovery was true, then nuclear fission, the splitting of atoms, could, in theory, unleash unimaginable power. And it had happened not in America or Britain, but in Nazi Germany. In January 1939, the news reached the United States. At Columbia University, a Hungarian émigré physicist named Leo Szilard read the papers and felt a familiar dread settle over him. 5 years earlier, he had predicted this very possibility, that a neutron striking an atom could cause it to split, releasing more neutrons, triggering a chain reaction. Now it wasn't theory anymore. It was fact. And he knew what it meant. "If it can happen once," Szilard said, "it can happen 1,000,000 times." He sought out his friend Enrico Fermi, the Italian physicist who had fled Mussolini's fascism. Fermi, too, understood the magnitude of what they were facing. They gathered other scientists, Niels Bohr, Eugene Wigner, Isidore Rabi, all of them refugees or exiles from Europe, all of them haunted by the same thought. What if Hitler built this weapon first? The discovery that began in a Berlin basement had just crossed the Atlantic, and it carried the seeds of a new world, or the end of the old one. Meanwhile, the experiment was being replicated everywhere. At Princeton, Harvard, and Berkeley, American physicists confirmed the findings. Each time uranium split, it emitted more neutrons, the key to a self-sustaining chain reaction. Theoretically, it could release a burst of energy so vast that no known material could contain it. What Hahn and Strassmann did with a few micrograms of uranium in a test tube could, under the right conditions, flatten a city. But these were scientists, not soldiers. They spoke in the language of equations and isotopes, not warfare. To them, the idea of an atomic bomb still belonged to science fiction. Yet one by one, the reality began to sink in. Leo Szilard later recalled the moment it became real for him. I remember standing on the street in New York, seeing the crowds go by, thinking that one day they might vanish in a single flash of light. That flash was still years away, but the clock had started ticking. In Germany, the implications of Hahn's discovery were not lost on the Reich's scientists. The Nazi regime quickly classified uranium research as a state secret. Military authorities began collecting all available uranium and heavy water, materials that could slow down neutrons and make a chain reaction possible. The Uranverein, or Uranium Club, was born. It was small, underfunded, and poorly organized, but to the scientists who had fled Europe, it was terrifying. In the safety of America, exiled physicists began to whisper about a terrible possibility. If Germany could weaponize this new discovery, it would possess a weapon that could make every bomb on Earth obsolete. A single device could destroy London, Moscow, or Paris. They decided they had to act, not as warriors, but as messengers. In the summer of 1939, Szilard and fellow physicist Eugene Wigner drove to a quiet seaside home on Long Island to visit the one man whose voice might be powerful enough to reach the White House, Albert Einstein. Einstein, already a living legend, listened quietly as Szilard explained the new physics of uranium fission and the danger it posed. When Szilard finished, Einstein leaned back and said softly, "I had not thought of that at all." They drafted a letter to President Franklin Roosevelt, warning that Nazi Germany might be building an atomic bomb and urging the United States to begin its own research. Einstein signed it reluctantly. He was a pacifist, a man who had devoted his life to peace, but he understood that inaction would be worse. The letter was sent in October 1939. It would become known as the Einstein-Szilard letter, and it would set in motion one of the most ambitious, secretive, and consequential projects in human history. By the time Roosevelt read the letter, war had already begun in Europe. Poland was gone, France would fall within months, and Britain was fighting for survival. Few in Washington understood the science behind the physicists' warning, but they understood fear. The president ordered the formation of the Uranium Committee to investigate the potential of nuclear fission. The age of atomic energy had begun, not with a weapon, but with an idea. The scientists who had once dreamed of unlocking the secrets of nature now found themselves at the edge of a moral abyss. They had split the atom, and in doing so, split the world in two. Before and after. When President Franklin D. Roosevelt read the Einstein-Szilard letter in October 1939, the world was already on fire. Hitler's armies had invaded Poland a month earlier, and Europe was sliding headlong into total war. The letter was brief, cautious, and couched in scientific language, but its implications were terrifying. It spoke of chain reactions and bombs of a new type, capable of destroying entire ports or cities in a single explosion. Roosevelt, a politician with no background in physics, looked up from the page and asked his aide, "What exactly are these boys trying to tell me?" His military advisor, General Edwin Watson, replied, "They think one bomb could blow up a whole city, Mr. President." Roosevelt set the letter down. "We'd better make sure the Nazis don't get one first," he said quietly. With that single sentence, America's path into the nuclear age began. The first effort was modest, a handful of scientists, a few $1,000s in funding, and a new committee called the Advisory Committee on Uranium. It met in secret in Washington in October 1939, chaired by Lyman Briggs of the National Bureau of Standards. On the committee sat men who would one day change the world: Leo Szilard, Enrico Fermi, and Eugene Wigner. They submitted their first report to Roosevelt a month later, suggesting research into fission chain reactions in uranium enrichment. But in 1939, few in the U.S. government believed such a weapon was possible. The military saw it as theoretical science, interesting perhaps, but irrelevant to a war fought with tanks and bombers. Funding trickled in slowly. It was fear, not curiosity, that kept the idea alive. In Europe, the nightmare that the physicists had warned about seemed to be unfolding. Germany's scientific institutions were among the best in the world. If they realized what Hahn and Strassmann's discovery meant, they could begin building a bomb before anyone else. And if Hitler's regime, already obsessed with superweapons, succeeded, no one could stop them. In early 1940, German scientists including Werner Heisenberg, the brilliant physicist who had once stood beside Niels Bohr in Copenhagen, began studying uranium chain reactions under the control of the Reich Research Council. Though the program suffered from poor coordination, rumors of it spread like wildfire among exiled scientists. The mere possibility was enough to spark panic. Szilard, Fermi, and others urged the U.S. to act faster. They argued that time, not money, was the critical factor. Every week of delay could mean 1 week closer to Hitler's bomb. At Columbia University, Fermi's small team began working with uranium oxide and graphite, testing whether a controlled chain reaction could be achieved. The physics was simple on paper, but maddening in practice. The key was moderation, slowing down neutrons so that they could sustain the reaction without exploding. Graphite could do it, theoretically, but impurities in the carbon stopped the reaction dead. Fermi's team scoured factories, searching for pure graphite blocks, often testing them in secret in the university's basement. They were experimenting with forces of nature no one had ever contained before. There were no safety guidelines, no radiation protocols, only intuition and courage. When the Geiger counters began to tick faster than usual, Fermi smiled faintly and said, "We are getting close." Meanwhile, another front opened: diplomacy and secrecy. Britain's own nuclear research effort, codenamed tube alloys, was making progress. Scientists there, including Otto Frisch and Rudolf Periels, both refugees from Hitler, calculated that a small amount of uranium-235 could create a chain reaction powerful enough to obliterate an entire city. The report, written in 1940, was the first serious blueprint for an atomic bomb. When the British shared it with the Americans, the effect was electric. For the first time, the possibility felt real. But it was a chilling reality. The same equations that promised unlimited energy for civilization could now annihilate it. In March 1941, the war took a darker turn. France had fallen, Britain stood alone, and German U-boats prowled the Atlantic. The physicists realized that if Britain fell, all their research would be lost or captured. The time for small committees was over. Szilard and Wigner went again to the White House, pressing for a coordinated national effort. This time, Roosevelt listened. He ordered the Army Corps of Engineers to begin organizing scientific resources for military use. It was the first seed of what would become the Manhattan Engineer District. But the final spark came from across the Atlantic. In September 1941, the Danish physicist Niels Bohr escaped from Nazi-occupied Denmark, carrying in his mind not just theoretical knowledge, but moral weight. Bohr, once Heisenberg's mentor, told the Allies that his former student was now working for the Reich. Heisenberg, Bohr said, believed Germany might build a bomb, and soon. The race had officially begun. Back in America, Enrico Fermi's experiments reached their climax. Their team began building Chicago Pile 1, a crude nuclear reactor made of uranium and graphite bricks stacked under the football stands at the University of Chicago. The project was so secret that even the university president didn't know. The scientists worked by lamplight in the cold December air, surrounded by armed guards. On the afternoon of December 2, 1942, Fermi ordered the final layer of uranium loaded into the pile. He stood before a blackboard covered in chalk equations and gave the signal to withdraw the control rods. The Geiger counters began to click faster, faster, then steady into a rhythmic pulse. The chain reaction had gone critical. For the first time in history, humanity had created a self-sustaining nuclear reaction. The room fell silent. No explosion, no light, just the quiet hum of energy being born. Physicist Arthur Compton called Washington and said, "The Italian navigator has landed in the New World." They celebrated with a bottle of Chianti, signing the label as witnesses to the birth of a new era. But even as they toasted, a terrible realization settled over them. The same process that could light a city could also destroy one. Every watt of power extracted from that atomic pile represented potential destruction on a scale no one could measure. The physicists who had fled Europe to escape tyranny now faced a paradox. To defeat fascism, they would have to build something more terrifying than fascism itself. Leo Szilard put it bluntly. We had to make it first, not because we wanted to use it, but because we couldn't let them use it against us. From this tension, fear and genius, morality and necessity, the Manhattan Project was born. And beneath the stands of a quiet American university, mankind had just unlocked the door to its own annihilation. It began with a single code name, the Manhattan Engineer District, chosen to disguise the largest scientific and industrial mobilization in history. It sounded ordinary, bureaucratic, forgettable. But behind those words, the United States was preparing to reshape the world. In the spring of 1942, the Army placed the project under the command of Brigadier General Leslie R. Groves, a man known for his iron discipline and ruthless efficiency. Groves had just finished building the Pentagon, the largest office building on Earth, and he was already restless for something bigger. Within days of taking command, he made two decisions that would define the entire project. First, he chose the man who would lead the scientific effort, J. Robert Oppenheimer, a brilliant, troubled theoretical physicist from Berkeley. Second, he gave the scientists unlimited resources. "Leave nothing to chance," he said. "We're building a weapon to end the war and possibly the world." From that moment, the Manhattan Project became not a laboratory, but a nation within a nation. By late 1942, its tendrils reached across the entire United States. Oak Ridge, Tennessee became the beating heart of uranium enrichment. Whole valleys were fenced off, their entrances guarded by military police. Entire towns were built from nothing. Streets, schools, barracks, power plants, all to feed the growing hunger for uranium-235. Workers wore no insignia, knew no details of what they were building. They were told only, "This will help win the war." In the desert of Hanford, Washington, another city rose, this one dedicated to producing plutonium, an element that existed nowhere on Earth before human hands made it. Inside vast concrete reactors, uranium slugs were bombarded with neutrons, slowly transmuting into the deadliest material ever created. The waste glowed faintly blue in the cooling pools, silent proof of a power that dwarfed imagination. And in Los Alamos, New Mexico, under the endless sky of the American Southwest, Oppenheimer gathered the greatest minds of a generation to design the bomb itself. They called it the Hill. Los Alamos was a paradox, part monastery, part military base. Scientists and their families lived in small wooden houses behind barbed wire. The air was thin and cold. Coyotes howled in the distance at night. The guards checked every letter, censored every photograph, and forbade anyone from speaking of their work. The scientists used code names even among themselves: the gadget, the device, the thing. Yet within those fences, genius flourished. Enrico Fermi built the experimental reactors. Hans Bethe led theoretical physics. Richard Feynman, the youngest of them all, cracked safes for fun and calculated the unthinkable. Niels Bohr, the great Dane who had fled Nazi-occupied Europe, arrived in 1943, speaking softly of moral responsibility while advising the men who were racing to build the most efficient killing machine in history. They argued about equations, efficiency, and ethics in the same breath. Can we make it smaller? One would ask. Can we make it safer? Another. But always, beneath every conversation, lay the same question that none dared speak aloud. Should we make it at all? Oppenheimer, the philosopher among physicists, tried to keep them focused. "We are not the destroyers," he said in one meeting. We are the instruments of necessity. Yet late at night, he walked alone under the desert stars, whispering verses from the Bhagavad Gita, the ancient Sanskrit text that would one day define him. The scale of the Manhattan Project defied comprehension. More than 130,000 people worked on it, scattered across dozens of sites. Entire cities were built and erased from maps. Their power consumption rivaled that of major industrial nations. The U.S. government poured over $2 billion, the equivalent of tens of billions of dollars today, into the effort. At Oak Ridge, young women known as Calutron girls sat at control panels adjusting dials on machines they didn't understand. Their job was to separate uranium isotopes by electromagnetic fields, a task so complex it required human intuition more than theory. They were told nothing about what they were doing. When asked after the war, one woman said, "We thought it had something to do with radar. Nobody guessed it was a bomb." At Hanford, the reactors worked night and day, generating enough plutonium to level cities. Workers there began to notice strange illnesses, burns that wouldn't heal, metallic tastes in their mouths. The doctors said nothing. The war needed to be won. The secrecy was absolute. Even Vice President Harry Truman had no idea what was happening until he became president. Scientists were forbidden from publishing their results. Mail was censored. Soldiers guarded every gate, every rail car. The phrase, "loose lips sink ships," became a mantra, but for the men and women of the Manhattan Project, loose lips might end the world. Still, rumors spread. Across America's heartland, people noticed trains hauling strange cargo, factories consuming electricity by the gigawatt, and towns appearing overnight. But no one asked too many questions. The nation trusted that whatever was happening was for victory and for peace. By 1944, the scientific race had become a fever. Two parallel bomb designs emerged. The first, Little Boy, used uranium-235, the rarer, more elusive isotope, purified painstakingly at Oak Ridge. The second, Fat Man, used plutonium from Hanford. It required a revolutionary method, implosion, compressing a plutonium core with precisely timed explosions. Every equation, every test, every sleepless night led to one purpose: detonation. But as the war in Europe turned against Germany, doubts began to creep in. The Reich was collapsing. Reports from intelligence showed that the Nazi uranium program had failed. It was years behind. The scientists realized they were no longer racing against Hitler. They were racing against themselves. What had begun as a desperate defense of civilization had become something else, a question of what civilization would mean once they succeeded. In April 1945, Oppenheimer gathered his senior staff and told them it was time. The theories were done. The prototypes were ready. The components were arriving by rail under armed guard. The first full test would take place in the New Mexico desert. Codename Trinity. The Manhattan Project had transformed from an idea into a machine built not just of steel and uranium, but of ambition, fear, and faith. Its creators no longer needed to imagine what splitting the atom could do. Soon, they would see it. As one Los Alamos scientist wrote in his diary that spring, "We are standing at the edge of history, and we are the ones pushing it forward." No one could know it yet, but the push would ignite the sky itself. Before dawn on July 16, 1945, the New Mexico desert lay still and silent, cloaked in darkness. The mountains of the Jornada del Muerto, the Journey of the Dead Man, stood like black walls against the horizon. At the center of that desolation, atop a 100-foot steel tower, rested a strange object wrapped in cables and wires, a sphere of metal and explosives no bigger than a melon. Its name was simple: the gadget. For 3 years, the scientists of Los Alamos had lived and breathed for this moment. It was the culmination of every sleepless night, every argument, every equation scribbled on blackboards and napkins. And now, in the pre-dawn chill, it was ready. General Leslie Groves stood in a command bunker 5 miles away, his uniform immaculate despite the sand and heat. Beside him, gaunt and chain-smoking, was J. Robert Oppenheimer. His face was pale, his eyes distant, as if he were both present and somewhere far beyond. Around them, physicists huddled over instruments, radios crackled, and tension hung like the still air before a storm. At 5:29 a.m., the countdown began. 30 seconds. Oppenheimer stepped forward, hands clasped behind his back. Some scientists turned away, shielding their eyes. Others stared through welder's glass, unable to look elsewhere. 10 seconds. The desert was utterly still. 3, 2, 1. A blinding white light erupted, not a flash, but a sunrise. The night vanished. Shadows of the mountains stretched for miles. The earth shook as a ball of fire rose into the heavens, expanding, twisting, turning from white to blue to orange. The shockwave rolled outward with a sound that shattered the silence of the world. The first atomic explosion had just occurred. No one spoke. For an instant, it was too beautiful to understand. The fireball towered into a column of boiling light, glowing brighter than the sun, crowned by a mushroom-shaped cloud that reached the stratosphere. The desert floor turned to glass. Oppenheimer lowered his glasses and whispered words from the Bhagavad Gita, his voice barely audible over the wind. "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." Beside him, physicist Kenneth Bainbridge nuttered, "Now we are all sons of bitches." The light faded. The dust began to fall like ash, and a new age began, the atomic age. The observers at the Trinity site were both triumphant and horrified. Their calculations had predicted an explosion equivalent to 5,000 tons of TNT. The actual yield was closer to 20,000 tons. The force of the blast vaporized the steel tower, melted the desert into green glass, later named trinitite, and left a crater more than 100 yards wide. Even from 10 miles away, the heat seared the skin of those watching. Shockwaves knocked men to the ground. In the distance, cattle were burned alive, their hides scorched by radiation no one yet understood. And then came silence. The scientists and soldiers stood in stunned awe, staring at what they had unleashed. One man broke the quiet. "It worked." Another answered, "God help us all." For Oppenheimer, the emotions were tangled. Triumph, fear, guilt, wonder. He had always imagined himself a man of intellect, detached from politics. But now, as the sky above New Mexico burned with a light not of this earth, he realized that he had crossed a line from which there was no return. That night in his quarters, he wrote a single sentence in his notebook: "The physicists have known sin." But Groves was already moving. The success of the test meant one thing: deployment. Within hours, coded messages were sent to Washington. The experiment was successful beyond expectations. President Harry Truman, attending the Potsdam Conference in Germany, received the news and smiled grimly. The war with Japan would soon end, one way or another. Back in Los Alamos, celebration mingled uneasily with dread. Some scientists cheered, others wept. A few, like Leo Szilard and James Frank, immediately drafted petitions urging that the bomb be demonstrated before being used on a city. They argued that science had gone too far, that humanity must be shown what this new power could do without shedding more blood. But others believed there was no choice. The Japanese military refused to surrender. An invasion of the home islands, according to American estimates, could cost up to 1 million Allied lives. The bomb, they reasoned, would end the war swiftly, and perhaps save lives in the long run. It was the cold arithmetic of necessity, and the morality of it would haunt them forever. In late July 1945, the uranium bomb Little Boy was loaded onto the cruiser USS Indianapolis and shipped across the Pacific under absolute secrecy. The plutonium bomb, Fat Man, followed soon after. The crews who handled them were told little, only that their cargo might end the war. On August 6, 1945, the first bomb was dropped on Hiroshima. The fireball destroyed everything within 2 miles of the blast center. A city of 300,000 vanished in seconds. 3 days later, Nagasaki followed. When Oppenheimer received confirmation of Hiroshima's destruction, he turned pale. Witnesses recalled him whispering, "Those poor little people." But he also said something else, something colder. "The job is done." The same mind that had dreamed of unlocking the energy of the stars now faced the fact that he had turned it into fire for war. Across the world, humanity awoke to a new reality. For the first time in history, one nation possessed the power to destroy civilization. The weapon built to end all wars had opened a door that could never be closed. At the Trinity site, months later, the glassy crater still shimmered in the desert sun. Soldiers roped off the area. Reporters were told only that an ammunition depot had exploded. Few ever knew that the world had changed there, on that quiet July morning, in the land called the Journey of the Dead Man. In the years to come, Oppenheimer would be celebrated as the father of the atomic bomb, and haunted by it. When asked what his thoughts had been at the moment of the explosion, he gave a simple, terrible answer. "We knew the world would not be the same. A few people laughed, a few people cried. Most people were silent." The silence of that moment still echoes through history, a silence born not of peace, but of awe. When the mushroom clouds over Hiroshima and Nagasaki finally dissipated, the world looked up and saw not victory, but revelation. For the first time in human history, mankind had built a weapon capable of extinguishing itself. The atomic bomb ended the Second World War, but it also ended an era. The age of limited war, of borders and armies, of the belief that destruction had a limit. On August 15, 1945, Emperor Hirohito's voice broke over Japanese radio waves, frail, trembling, human. "We have resolved," he said, "to endure the unendurable." The war was over. Across the Pacific, sailors cheered, civilians flooded the streets, and the United States celebrated peace. Yet, among the men who had built the bomb, peace was not what they felt. In Los Alamos, as the news spread, the scientists gathered in the mess hall. Some clapped, others wept. Oppenheimer stood silently in the corner, his face unreadable. He knew the war had ended, but not the story he had begun. The world had entered a new epoch, one defined by fear. In the weeks that followed, the United States sent inspection teams into Hiroshima and Nagasaki. What they found defied description. Entire neighborhoods had vanished, not collapsed, not burned, vanished, erased from existence. Asphalt had melted into glass. Human shadows were burned into walls. Doctors spoke of a new kind of wound, invisible burns that appeared days later. Bodies blackened from within. Children's hair falling out in clumps. Dr. Michihiko Hachiya, director of Hiroshima's Communications Hospital, wrote in his diary, "We did not yet have a name for it. We only knew that death had changed its face. The bomb had done more than destroy cities. It had redefined what destruction meant." In Washington, President Harry T. Truman faced a moral paradox as immense as the weapon itself. He told the American people, "We have used it to shorten the agony of war, to save the lives of thousands and thousands of young Americans." Yet privately, he confessed to aides that he had lost sleep over the decision. The world hailed him as the man who ended the war, but history would forever ask if he had also begun something worse. For the scientists, the reckoning came even sooner. Leo Szilard, the man whose warning letter to Roosevelt had started it all, called for civilian control of nuclear power. Others, like James Franck and Niels Bohr, urged the creation of international agreements before another bomb could ever be built. They saw clearly that the next war would not be fought with tanks or rifles, but with annihilation. Yet, the momentum of history was already against them. The bomb had become not just a weapon, but a symbol of power, prestige, and dominance. In August 1949, the Soviet Union detonated its own atomic bomb. The monopoly was gone. What had been a single weapon now became a race, the nuclear arms race. America responded with a hydrogen bomb, a weapon 1,000 times more powerful. Tests lit up the Pacific skies like artificial suns, shockwaves flattening atolls and vaporizing coral reefs. Scientists watched in horror as their creation escaped their control. The atom had become the currency of fear. Oppenheimer, once hailed as a hero, now found himself an outcast. In 1949, he opposed the development of the hydrogen bomb, warning that it would turn deterrence into mutual suicide. When you see something that is technically sweet, you go ahead and do it, and you argue about what to do with it only after you've had your technical success. But in the age of politics and paranoia, nuance was treason. In 1954, during the height of the Red Scare, Oppenheimer was accused of being a communist sympathizer and stripped of his security clearance. The father of the atomic bomb became its first martyr. As he left the courtroom, humiliated, he murmured to a friend, "The physicists have known sin, and this is the punishment." The world he helped create now lived under the shadow of the atom. In classrooms, children practiced duck-and-cover drills. Cities built fallout shelters. Diplomats wrote treaties with trembling hands. For the first time, humanity's survival depended not on courage, but on restraint. Yet, amid the terror, there were also miracles. The same science that birthed the bomb lit up the world. Nuclear energy powered cities. Medical isotopes cured cancers. Satellites launched into orbit carried instruments designed by atomic physicists. The atom had become both destroyer and savior, proof that creation and destruction were twins bound in the same equation. But the lesson of 1945 never vanished. At Hiroshima, a peace park now stands where the city once burned. The ruined dome of the old industrial promotion hall remains as it was on that August morning, blackened, hollow, skeletal. Every year, survivors gather there, their voices growing fewer, their memories sharper. They speak not of vengeance, but of warning. I saw light brighter than the sun, but I hope my grandchildren never see it again. Their words are echoes from the dawn of the atomic age, the same dawn that Oppenheimer and his colleagues watched rise over the desert. By the dawn of the 21st century, the number of nuclear weapons on Earth had exceeded 13,000. They sit in silos, on submarines, in bombers that circle the globe. Each one holds the power of millions of tons of TNT. Each one is a reminder that in 1939, in a quiet laboratory, humanity learned how to split the atom, and in doing so, split its destiny. The scientists who made it possible are long gone now, but their words remain, carved into the conscience of the world. When asked in his final years what he felt about the bomb, Oppenheimer answered softly, in some crude sense, which no vulgarity, no humor, no overstatement can quite extinguish, the physicists have known sin, and this is a knowledge they cannot lose. In the end, the story of the atomic bomb is not just about science or war, it is about choice. The same equation, E equals mc2, can light a city or level it. The same human mind that builds can destroy. The fire born in the desert in 1945 has never gone out. It burns in reactors, in arsenals, in the collective memory of a species that once touched the power of the stars and did not know what to do with it. We split the atom, and in that moment, we split ourselves, forever caught between brilliance and ruin.